Hello, I'm Stephen Robinson. Welcome to the Play Typer Guy podcast. Joining me today is author Lisa Tolin of the book Can You Imagine the Art and Life of Yoko Ono? For those who actually watch this, I'm going to try to show it because it is stunning. First off, before I ask you, Lisa, can you tell me a bit about the artist you worked with? Because I mean, your prose is amazing in this, but this just looks beautiful, and I was just kind of blown away.
It's illustrated by Yaz Imamura, who's a super talented artist out, I think, your way in Portland. And the usual process for picture books is that, you sell the manuscript to a publisher and then the publisher finds the illustrator, finds the right illustrator for the project. So you don't actually ever work together. I think they worry that writers are going to boss the illustrator around, or which I wouldn't do, but I can imagine it happening. So she really took the words and ran with it, which is such a cool experience because you get to you kind of set it free and then it comes back to you in this very physical form and the way she interpreted the words are not necessarily what I expected or and it's I think the work is so beautiful. I want to hang it all around my house. It's really quite stunning. And she found themes and that I hadn't mentioned in the text that she pulled out. And, you know, it's Yoko Ono's life. So we had to deal with some pretty dark material. I mean, first of all, the hatred that she faced through all parts of her life. And then obviously the assassination of her husband. That's pretty tough stuff to do in a children's picture book, but I think she found incredibly beautiful and poignant ways to do it.
And so, obviously, speaking of Yoko Ono, such a tremendous figure, someone who I think there's no American or obviously a person in England who doesn't have an opinion, and we'll get into what that means. But so you interviewed her about 20 years ago, if I recall,
Hmm.
which was 2005. I actually did the math. It's like, oh, that's actually 20 years ago. But in 2005, and I remember being very jealous of this one that you met Yoko Ono, but you were as a big fan of Rosemary's Baby, you were in Dakota. Uh,
Hmm.
so could you tell us about that experience, both meeting her and also going to sort of this historic building and home?
No demon babies on this particular occasion. So I really lucked out there. But yeah, it's kind of a fortress of a building, and you go in these gates, and there's like a sign-in desk, and I don't know if she had her own. I think they have different elevators for different parts of the building, and so just going in and seeing the apartment and seeing, um, the white room. I don't think it's like the white room where they filmed the video because I think that was in England, but it was a white room with the white piano, and it's like the history is all kind of right there in front of you, and so it's really amazing to be in that space. And then I met her, and I grew up like a lot of people probably hearing her story from the Beatles perspective of and not necessarily a flattering portrait. Um, and I met her and I was just kind of blown away by her presence. She was just this amazing, intelligent, thoughtful person. And I was just like, it's feels silly, but my first thought was like, of course he loved her because, I was pulled in too. Like I can see her massive presence and charisma and intelligence. And so I had that feeling that she wasn't the person who I thought she was kind of instantly.
A lot of this is sort of relevant now in the sense of we saw playing out sort of in similar ways with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, this idea of the intruder, often a woman of color, coming in and sort of blowing up the system. And uh, obviously there are theories about why certain women are sort of treated this way, or what had happened. Kind of appealed to me about this book was that it's not so much sort of justifying her point of, her point of view or her life. It was more of just she is an incredible person of her own right, even outside of, even if she had never met the Beatles, her life is quite compelling. For folks, again, it's all in this book and beautifully done, but can you tell people a bit about just her life, how it began and everything?
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people know that she's a survivor of the firebombing of Tokyo, that she fled with her family to the countryside. She came from a very privileged background, but there were expectations of a girl in Japan at that time in that social class. And she obviously really rebelled against all of those expectations and continued to do that throughout her life. I mean, throughout her life, people were dismissive of the art she was making at times reverent. It was sort of like she had these polar opposite views of who she was and what she was doing. Um, and I was so fascinated by how she was able to just kind of keep being herself through all that because I don't know, I'm a people pleaser. I find it hard when someone looks at me sideways. So for somebody to kind of endure all of that hatred after she met John Lennon, um, and still keep going was remarkable. Is remarkable. So she had, she was a really, as you say, compelling artist in her own right. She had conceptual art that was really, I think, ahead of its time and groundbreaking. And she's finally kind of getting her due as an artist. She's got pieces at the MoMA, and she just had a huge exhibit at the Tate, London. So I do think, in some ways, when John Lennon called her the world's most famous artist who nobody knows. So it was that like she became famous because of her connection to the Beatles, but she made art that was worth knowing fully separate from their relationship.
Um, and I think your choice to work on this subject, I think, is has an interesting connection to sort of why you started kind of entering into picture books for children. I mean, could you tell folks about that story? Because I find that interesting. Because your first book about why you decided to enter into that realm.
Yeah, my first book was called How to Be a Rock Star, and that was very much inspired by my son who plays a lot of music. And then he um, became a huge Beatles fanatic. I mean, in preschool, his favorite book was the Beatles Dictionary of Songs. When he went to preschool, they like brought out special Beatles stuff just for him because they knew this was kind of his obsession, the way other kids were into trucks. So helped me sort of dive back into that world, and I realized, you know, Yoko Ono continues to be portrayed unfairly to a new generation of kids. Um, and I wanted to sort of reclaim her image, I guess.
And sort of her essential weirdness, perhaps. And I say this in a delightful way because I mean, a lot of you would imagine even say Tina Fey on say 30 Rock or any sort of show mocking an artist who does weird things. And
Hmm.
there is a part of the art of kind of like we can be weird, but not this weird. And if you go beyond this realm, if you're too outside the box, will you're going to be a subject of ridicule. I think certainly in our culture, there are certain things on Broadway and down that is a little bit more supportive of. That's a bit strange, but I
Hmm.
mean, it's definitely Yoko was someone who was like, okay, that's a little too weird. You're doing Primal Scream, you're doing that. I mean, I kind of I've always enjoyed some of it because it was so wow. I never would have thought of that or anything. But I think there was this idea that it is just weird for its own sake. And so it's nice that you sort of put some kind of in context of the work she did and what she was exploring.
I mean, it's all made to make you think, right? It's not.
Mm.
She can make very beautiful art and has and does. She's quite a talented artist with a pen. Um, and she is a classically trained pianist. You know, she could play Bach for you if you wanted, but this was a deliberate choice to do something that would, um, yeah, break boundaries, be different, make you think, make you laugh, make you consider things in a new way. And there isn't a lot of art in general that makes you do that. I would say not just visual art, um, movies, everything. It's like you can the ones that really stick with you and make you think about the world in a different way are pretty special. And I think she made that kind of art.
And you talked about your son being a fan of the Beatles. There is sort of this cultural inheritance of the Beatles, right? Like we talk about somewhere there's a teen with suddenly now has long hair and glasses. They fall into that. It was both when we were kids around that age, and then now
Mm,
for our kids' generation, it just seems to keep occurring, which is great. Just great thing about the Beatles music, but at the same time, it does come that sort of, I wouldn't say cultural baggage, but that sense of because the Yoko or had becomes almost an epithet. It's interesting that you're sort of kind of helping kids at this age to sort of see her, to not kind of come into the Beatles and like, oh, and here's this punchline. John got
right.
weird, and she's part of the punchline of an artist getting too into himself and too weird, and really humanizing her, which I think is so important.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny you mentioned, this kind of trope of the foreign, intruder taking the man away. And she has referenced that and said it was like I stole their treasure. And the idea, I mean, if like it's funny, we all grow up with it and we're like, well, yeah, of course Yoko took him away. And then you think about it, and okay, if he's this brilliant artist with like who has, by the way, demonstrated quite a bit of weirdness already on his own in the Beatles. Um, like what did she do? Voodoo? Like how did she mind control him into leaving the Beatles? It just doesn't make sense if you think he's this brilliant and intelligent artist. It's like if we don't like Beyonce's new country album, are we going to blame Jay-Z? Like, no, because, if it was the reverse, we probably would. It's just like we like to blame women for things we don't like men doing.
Yeah, and everyone had the idea that they would, you know, be like the Rolling Stones, or even now U2. A band
Hmm.
has kind of been, they'll sort of age together forever, but that was never going to happen if you actually study the period they were about to break up anyway. Um, as the great philosopher Spike from Buffy the Vampire Slayer put it, Yoko did not break up the Beatles. They were already about to break up. She just got blamed. So what you had told me about how these picture books work, part of it was sort of terrifying to me, right? Because don't you don't work with it, like you don't pick the artist, right? It's not like,
Hmm.
so my own experience with like say comic books or whatever, there's at least a professional relationship, or like I know who this artist is and this person's doing my work, but it really does, so you kind of let go and they pair you with someone. What is that like? Is it as terrifying as I
Yeah.
think it is, or are you're more well adjusted than I am?
Well, I only have 2 books at this point, and they've both turned out beautifully and beyond my expectations. So I think my general thought is that they're gonna have a much better vision than I do, and I should try to trust that. But yeah, it's scary to give up your work if you don't know what it's gonna come back as. But I did know, I'd seen Yaz's art, that it's not they do ask for your input a little bit, so I'm sure I could have steered it a little, but I was in love with what she'd done already, so I wasn't too worried.
And you guys talked a bit. Did she have any sort of awareness of Yoko? I mean, everyone does, but like to the extent that you and I might have.
Yeah, I don't think she, like, was a huge, you know, um, student of Yoko or, Beatles fan or any of those things, but I do know she was inspired by her art and that she kind of tried new techniques in this, book to loosen up her style and sort of um, make it more Yoko-esque in a way. And I think, that's a really big challenge for an illustrator to try to draw something involving an artist. That's intimidating. I would think, it's like
Um,
writing about a writer, like, ugh.
and I will definitely get back to this book, though. You are editorial director at Pen America, and I just had noticed recently. So you've met Judy Blume, who.
I
So
did.
you seem to have a whole of meeting some of the most impressive from my life figures imaginable, regardless of gender, but specifically of women. Um, and she's someone who's was one of the most banned authors and has really, but has done just tremendous work as well and so forth. Were you a fan of Judy Blume growing up?
Oh
You said you read her work.
my God, of course. Yeah. And my kids are fans now. Her work is incredible. And I think was the start of realizing that like that was something books could do, like I don't think before Judy Blume I ever read something that reflected my life in the way that it felt like Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret did, even though obviously the experiences were very different. There's something about the way she writes that feels very close to the bone. So yeah, she's been banned since the 80s, and been through a lot with that. So we've worked with her on book bans at Pen America. She's been very supportive of the efforts. I think she understands what it is. She's reading genderqueer. She's reading the books that are being banned now, and she understands the issues involved. It it's gotten worse since she was first banned. Now they're using laws to do it. I don't. Back when it was Jerry Falwell and the moral majority, I think they were just out there crusading. Um, sort of library to library, but now they're doing it state to state.
Yeah, and that is a good point because I think I go back and I grew up in Greenville, South Carolina, and the books that I had access to or teachers would, regardless of their politics, I'm sure there were conservative teachers who would give me either her books or other books that would now like be on the radar of a teacher could get in serious trouble for. So it does seem like it has sort of gotten worse in that kind of regard. Um, but Bloom, especially, I think, was someone who uh, I like, even for young boys, because she did then again, maybe I won't, which is one I
Hmm.
really attracted to as a child. But she did a great job of, even if Margaret is such a compelling character, even if you're a boy and God has no, I don't, probably did not have any real idea of what she was going through, but I did by the end of, if that makes sense. It's like, I haven't heard
Hmm.
of this. I think I might have even raised a question while reading it, but it was done in a way of like, it's so relatable. We talk about a period of our time now where, empathy is so important. And I think that's the example of it. Like, it's impossible not to, regardless of your background, empathize with Margaret or, you know, the Black family integrating into a neighborhood, like at Iggy's house. Everyone involved in that you would empathize with, of what the change, what is change. Change is scary. And I think more of that is going to be kind of important moving forward. So I think my
I'm
wife had
glad
met.
you liked it too.
Oh yeah.
Just because I think now there's such a tendency to steer boys to the boy books and girls to the girl books, and I try to push against that with my kids, but there's a definite division there. But you're right, empathy is important. It's like you need to learn about all kinds of people, including of the opposite gender. So
Yeah, things happening to you that you don't understand is sort of universal, right? And I think kind of understanding what other people are going through is going to be uh is really key. Um the history, again, going back again to Can You Imagine, though, obviously I knew, because I know Ono's age. I know a bunch about like that she was there, but there's just something about and you describe it so beautifully in the prose here of just living through such a traumatic experience, especially now I have a son around how old she would have been at that, and I can imagine like what that must be like is astonishing. I don't know if when you were interviewing her, she talked much about it to you, or whether that's part of was your outside research.
Most of our interview was unfortunately about John because I was interviewing her for a musical about his life. So that was from outside research into her background. But that was a real turning point for her. It was when she, I think, realized that she could use her imagination to escape her circumstances. That she described lying on the ground with her brother and kind of looking up at gaps through a roof of a building. And so, she asked him, she knew he was hungry, and she said, "What do you want to eat?" And he said, "Ice cream." And she said, "Well, that's dessert. We should start with soup." And she kind of imagined this whole menu. So it was literally her imagination nourishing her. And that became huge for everything she did after that. So, um,
And that led to Imagine the song, correct? Because I think a lot of people still don't know this, but she was given credit as a co-writer of perhaps
right.
Lennon's most popular or most well-known solo song, Imagine.
Yes. He said, it all came from her saying, "Imagine this, imagine that." That's her art. She did a lot of um, word, like poetry art, where she would say, imagine the clouds dripping and, dig a hole in the earth to put it in. I don't know if I got that exactly right, but, she was sort of imagining these absurd and surreal things. And if you stop to imagine them, you sort of expand your worldview. So I think too, they had, of course, Imagine Peace, and they had a big campaign. And I think people have been over the years a little bit dismissive of that too. But knowing that she is a survivor of war, and that she uses her imagination in this way, I think the message of it becomes more powerful when you realize where it's coming from, because it's not just like, "Oh, imagine something." It's really like you can change the world, and it starts in your brain, really. Like you have to see it to make it happen.
And yeah, she's sort of someone who you can always imagine whatever major issue today, especially whatever war, either in the Middle East or whatever political issue happening here, um, where she might stand on it if she were the age she was in the 60s, and
Mhm.
Lennon was that age and now, and the obvious backlash to that. So that's sort of she was someone who was kind of always going to be confrontational, but that's a good thing. I mean, that's sometimes you need someone to sort of challenge the sort of status quo. Uh, and you said you were talking to her um, about her husband, former John Lennon, and she had kind of wound up being sort of the custodian of this tremendous amount of work. I mean, she didn't marry him for his work, but she nonetheless wound up having to sort of be the custodian and caretaker for that, and that must be a tremendous responsibility, as well, like of how do you deal with that?
She was the business person in their marriage. There was a time when he was really staying home and taking care of Sean, and she was running the business of their, music and everything else that was going on. So she was also like 10 years older than him, I think.
Mhm.
So it was a very, and obviously interracial couple. There was a lot of things that people were disturbed by at that time that are really pretty amazing to look back on.
Yeah, I mean, it's also kind of getting to earlier. There's often people who there's a big fuss over, and then within our kind of modern lens, we say, "Oh, if this happened today, we'd be so chill." And as I was saying, no, 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 we would we would give her a lot of grief. Um, And again, I mean, I like Prince Harry well enough. Seems nice. He did not record the White Album or anything. So like Brit was like really like he's not like you're really upset with this lady for some for this one
Right.
thing.
He's best known for his Nazi armband, I believe. Yeah, I don't know.
Yes, but yeah, the Beatles were a tremendous, but you know, John had his own sort of Nazi armband moments in the sense of basically saying things that were or saying or doing things that were not particularly ideal. He was not quite as savvy in that regard as say Paul, and this was all before, as you said, it was all before he met Yoko. It wasn't like he was this, you know, I would say upstanding British
Right.
guy who before he meets her, they were very similar, which is why they how they married. And in the ways that they're different, as you said, like she was sort of the business person and and focused, as opposed to, I think there would be this tendency to sort of view her as the flake, right? Like she's just art,
Hmm.
this goofball who does bad art and necessarily obviously not who she is at all. Do you get a sense that our world has sort of changed, like physical media with books and everything? Um, do you feel like this is that kids are still that the children's bookstores, are they still existing, or people, I mean, because I obviously love taking my son to one. There's one in our neighborhood and finding books for him or something and going and buying the physical media, even though before I had a child, I had just sort of stopped. Everyone, I had kind of gone completely digital. I love the idea that like what I could have all the books at my command on my
Hmm.
sci-fi device, and I would read them. And then now I something like this is just wonderful because if you have a kid, it's just something great. The physical media is such a wonderful part of that experience. Is that part of what sort of drew you into sort of doing children's books or whatever, that aspect of that connection, that experience of being a parent and taking them to a bookstore?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are apps now. There's everything for kids too, the way but I do think, a lot of parents are conscious of trying to limit screen time. And so when even your books are on screens, it's kind of, I don't know, it feels like a losing battle. There's still something about holding a physical object and being able to turn it. And you could see, I don't know, my kids, like even before they could read, they wanted to turn the pages of the books. They wanted to see the pictures. They wanted to eat the book. It's just like the book as a physical thing is, I think, really important for kids, especially. I still like them as a grown up too, but they do take up a lot of space in a New York apartment. So
There is something about, yeah, like just holding it. This is yeah, I'm so glad you share. I have this copy because in display in my home, and it's such a
oh, thank
lovely
you.
lovely work of art, beautifully done. and and I am fortunate enough because my copy is signed. I can't show you, but my copy is signed by the author, so it's a great privilege. Um, and so in the time I have left, I know obviously with the work you do and whatever. What is your take on just, I guess, the impact upon what people can read or what kids can read or the arts and everything? I think there's, are you inclined to sort of say these things will pass, this has always been going on, or do you have a different, perhaps more concerning, alarming view of it?
Yeah, I hate to be the doomsday person, but it is alarming. And I'm one of the nice things about living in New York City is that my kids are learning true history in all its complexity and all its ugliness. They're learning right off the bat that the founders had slaves. They're not, this isn't something that is being taken out of their curriculum the way it is in Florida or Texas by fiat. It's just, I worry about the kids there. I worry about kids everywhere, but what happens when they all get to college and they've just been exposed to completely different realities? How are they going to have intelligent conversations if the actual reality of the world has been kept from them? And that's more about the kind of classroom restrictions around, especially around race. There are laws where, anything that would make a white kid uncomfortable shouldn't be talked about. Um, that's crazy. And then there are also the don't say gays, and that's being replicated around the country too, where obviously these kids are gonna, I'm sure they have friends whose parents are gay. I'm sure obviously many of them will be somewhere in the LGBTQ community, and to be told that that is somehow inappropriate for being talked about or learned about, just the existence of gay people. I mean, I don't know if you've seen any of the rhetoric around this Supreme Court decision that's upcoming, Mahmoud versus Taylor. One of the books involved is called Pride Puppy, and it's an adorable book. It's like an alphabet book. I don't know, I can't remember what all the letters are for, but it's a very sweet and affirming. And then they've taken it and tried to make it seem like the book is about bondage and things that aren't there, like
Mhm.
because there's leather. It's a woman wearing a leather jacket, and they've tried to say it's somehow sexual. Just the existence of gay people is, in their minds, sexual. Um, it's it's really scary to me that kids are going to grow up in this kind of environment, and I hope
Well,
we can collectively get the will to turn it around. But when you're passing laws, that's hard.
which is why I think it's so great that you did this with Yoko. I mean, because Yoko Ono is such a recognizable figure. People get that. And I think, and I want to stress this again, this is not about sort of relitigating the Beatles thing and just sort of like a version, this incident through her version is specifically to me about this is a great figure in history in the arts on her own. And it's really impressive. Are do you what's the breakdown? Do you have sort of insight into um like what the audience is? Is it more, more girls or more boys, or who do you think it's reaching? Do you have any insight into that yet? Or is that kind of
I
that
don't
granular?
yet. Yeah, I mean, I hope it would be, um, you know, potentially used in art classrooms or music classrooms or, regular history classrooms, um, to talk about some of these issues. Um, there's a lot there. It's conceptual art. It's like a way to kind of introduce that to kids, but it's also just this really what stands out to me is her strength of character. And, even if you think she's just a person creating weird, terrible art, as you say, the strength that it took to do that, given everything around her, given her background, given everything she lived through, is incredible. So just that resilience, the ability to make weird art and not be intimidated, I hope is inspiring to kids because we need a lot more weird art.
I'm also impressed as a New Yorker that you did not try to sort of get at least on a list for her apartment, like just kind of just so, hey, if Sean doesn't want it,
Yeah,
like I'm really nice. There's a photo of my kid. They're great kids. Please, we would love
I
the
promise to take care of that piano. I promise.
there. It's just insane if you because I tell people if you live in New York, if you obviously there's a normal new apartments and there's apartments like that are just like, oh my god, like, and then you have these insane views.
Yeah.
It is and the history with that. It's whenever I get back to the city, I love walking up uh Central Park West, and I was there, my son and wife, and just the Dakota itself is so stunning. Um, though at the same time, um, you know, uh, she stayed after obviously her husband being, murdered out there. That's itself impressive. I know that's something that would be so potentially traumatic. but he was someone who sort of mingled with the people. They both did, which is a very New York thing, right? And that's sort of this horrible kind of wave of gun violence, which again has always been going on,
Mhm.
is so is so tragic. But um, well, where can people get this book beyond? Obviously, I try to, I know I get stuff on Amazon. I know it's the easiest way, but if there are other methods, where can they find this book? At sort of, is it at pretty much any children's bookstore in a?
I mean, I would, you never know if they stock something, but I think you can request it at any
Yes.
bookstore, and you can order it on Barnes and Noble, whether they have it in the physical store. I'm not, it probably depends, but yeah. Or I love bookshop.org. I don't know if you shop there, but they are another great online retailer that actually gives money to indie bookstores, which is
Yeah,
nice.
great. And of course, I'm a theater person, and I've done work with children's theaters. Are you someone who would be up for adapting this to a
Oh my God.
yeah?
Of course.
So yes, local theater companies, contact her. It is the prose is lovely. I think it would make a great kind of a piece. Young people would really appreciate it, and it's really moving in parts. I won't spoil it, but like how you tie into from the earliest traumatic event in her life to one of the later ones is really beautifully done. So I highly recommend people check out this book. Can You Imagine the Art and Life of Yoko Ono? Beautifully illustrated, beautifully written. I'll keep the info down below. And Lisa, thank you for taking the time to chat with me, and all the work you do, both as an author and of course at Penn. And we will catch you folks next time. Take care.
Thanks, Stephen.